right, welcome back to another interview episode of Breakthrough Marketing Secrets. I'm really excited because, as far as I know, you are the first group of copywriters that are getting to hear directly from our guest. And yet, at the same time, he has so much to help copywriters and marketers who are crafting persuasive messages to succeed. And so, Bill, we'll get into your bio in a second here, but I want to start. When I was going through your new book, Writing for Impact, there was a quote that jumped out at me. Engaging writing is reward-filled writing. So what do you mean by that? And how does that inform our approach to writing?
Yeah. That's the meat of the book. I like to say that the mantra that you should take away from my book is reward your reader. And what does that mean? Since I examined a mountain of research from psychologists and neuroscientists around the world, what that means is two things. It's the general meaning as we'd all understand it. A reward is just something nice you get for something you did well. But in neuroscience, a reward is actually a process in the brain where dopamine is released. It evaluates what it's receiving, which in the case of writing is words, deciding whether it's worthy. And in the best cases, there's actually dopamine releasing a little bit of natural opioids in the brain to give people pleasure. So reward-filled writing is our objective. That's how you engage people. The reward in the brain is how people are motivated to do anything. And you want to motivate them, obviously, not just to start reading, but to keep reading.
Yeah, and no matter the style of writing, the idea of like a novel is a page turner, right? Like what's on the next page?
Right.
That's the kind of writing that we want to pull people in.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, Bill Birchard is a writer, writing coach, and book consultant. He was once a magazine editor and later a freelance journalist for Fast Company, CFO, and Strategy and Business. He writes today about the neuroscience and psychology of writing. His most recent book, which I highly recommend, I've been through it already, it just came out, is Writing for Impact, 8 Secrets from Science that will fire up your readers' brains. And it reveals how to transform your writing with these science-based strategies. Earlier books include Stairway to Earth, Merchants of Virtue, Nature's Keepers, The 1 Minute Meditator, and Counting What Counts. And his work for other authors includes 10 books of nonfiction about management, health, economics, business, policy, technology, and the environment. And he's from Amherst, New Hampshire.
Okay.
Yeah, Bill. So I think that a lot of us are maybe familiar with this, with the experience of the reward circuit and the dopamine, all of that going off. So, but just so we understand that, so we can recognize when we've had those experiences ourselves, what does that impactful writing feel like to the reader?
Yeah, right. Oftentimes it doesn't feel like anything exactly. I mean, what's happening is your brain is motivating you all the time to do different things, and you may not feel the motivation, but you make the decision based on what the brain is processing. The brain says, hey, this is a fantastic word, or this is a fantastic phrase, or this is a fantastic idea. I want to pursue it. And the dopamine is telling you to do that. So that may not feel a lot like anything. That's sort of an unconscious process. However, if you really, really hit it right, the dopamine then triggers the release of natural opioids in 5 different what's called pleasure hotspots in the brain. These are places that when the opioid is released, make you feel pleasure. Simple as that. And in the best of cases, of course, you're going to feel things like tingles and goosebumps and a chill down the spine. Wouldn't we all like to do that, in every paragraph? Of course, we're not going to, but you can activate that circuit continuously, phrase to phrase, sentence to sentence, to get people to follow what you're reading and keep reading. And I should say that the reward circuit serves several purposes. It creates desire, it creates pleasure, and it creates the desire to learn. Because what is the reward circuit for? Evolutionarily, we had to have something in our brain that made us want to do things and made us want to learn things so that we survived and thrived. And this is like a paleo part of the brain. This is right in the center of your head. We share this with other animals. This is really, really an ancient part of the brain, and we are ruled by it.
Absolutely. So there's this ancient part of the brain, that the reward circuit, that uh, drove us, I suppose, like uh, for whatever reason, pre-human animals needed to go do something in order to survive, right? There was this
Right,
need for pursuit, this need to go after something, and there had to be a reinforcement of that pursuit behavior as well, right?
right,
All
exactly,
in the brain. And that leads us to like the development of those structures in the brain are like they predate language, right? But they
exactly,
can
yeah,
feed our consumption of language, I suppose. This reminds me. So Marty Edelston, very famous entrepreneur, the late Marty Edelston, founded Boardroom Inc., which you may also know as Bottom Line Brands. So they did Bottom Line Personal, Bottom Line Health, all of that. Huge direct mailer for a very long time. And he said when he reviewed a piece of marketing copy, his biggest question that he asked was, "Does this make me vibrant?" And I feel like it's the exact same thing. Like
exactly.
there's not a specific reaction necessarily that you're looking
Mhm,
for, because certain copy may, if it makes you feel anxious, it's vibration.
mhm.
If it makes you feel excited about something, it's vibration, right? So yeah, I just
Exactly,
think of
so
that in the context of this.
yeah, yeah. So I think what you're saying is what I like to say in the book is when we consume language, we distinguish between what's great and what isn't great. In the same way when we consume anything else, whether it's a donut or it's a desire to have a friend or it's to build shelter or it's to have sex, it doesn't matter. We're consuming that, and the brain then is evaluating the prospect of consuming that, the pleasure we get from consuming that, and what we learn from consuming that. And we are driven moment to moment to do that.
Absolutely. And it's so self-reinforcing. So at a high level, in writing for impact, you broke down impactful, compelling, interesting writing into 8 strategies that have been revealed by science, right?
Right.
And these are all like in the book. It's great because you have like study after study coming at each of these from a different angle. And how to use them, right? But can we start by just listing out these 8 strategies,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then we can get into them a little bit deeper?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I would say up front that I isolated 8 strategies that I felt came out of the research that I looked at. I scooped up every scientific paper I could find that was looking at what happened to people when they were reading. It could be
Yeah.
experiments that they behaved differently. It could be experiments where they were taking MRI images of their brain, and out of that came support for these 8 strategies. When I started, I actually had a couple that were different, and they weren't supported, so I got rid of them.
Hmm.
I went in with a bit of a hypothesis, right? I've been a writer my whole life. I had an idea what worked. I had an idea of what the principles were. Um, I wanted to put them to the test. Does the science show that these are real? Do these really work? One didn't. One I completely changed. But anyway, so I'll list the 8 of them that I think are really stand tall among what I think are the drivers of reward in the brain.
Hold on. Can I interject and ask
Sure.
which one got kicked out? Like, what was the assumption that got kicked out?
Well, one was that okay, so I should first say that the 8 are all begin with an S, right? So they're my 8
Yeah.
S's. Um, the one was style. All of them are keep it something, right? Keep it simple, keep it specific. Let me list them all, and then I'll come back.
Okay.
Keep it simple, keep it specific. These are going to sound familiar, right? Keep it
Yes.
surprising, keep it stirring. That is some emotion in there. Keep it seductive. And in my case, that means create anticipation and suspense. Keep it smart, which in my case means drive ahas, drive insight, not just information. Don't just deliver information, deliver insights. Keep it social, which has got some humanity in there, some social connection. We're all driven by that. And finally, keep it story driven, right? That's sort of the symphony of all the other strategies put together, plus a little bit more. So originally I had keep it stylish. I thought, your own kind of personal voice and kind of some clever wording. And in the end, there are some research where scientists have tried that, but they couldn't pin it down. I mean, what the hell does that mean? What does style mean? And then it was
For
not
sure.
clear that that did drive the reward circuit, although I think it does. I mean, that might be another S sometime somebody else could add and find the research on, but I couldn't. So I dumped it. And what I realized I was missing, on the other hand, was keep it social, which is, we could get into the detail of that, but it's like you want to create a human connection. And there's a particular way in reading, because of course, when people are reading, they're not with other people. Generally, they're all by themselves with the author's words in front of them. And that became a very, very important stimulant in the book. Another one is when I started with keep it seductive, I thought, oh, that means you should. And some of these are from my experiments. Intuitively, I was thinking these things are important. You should play to sort
Yeah.
of the aspirations and the sort of the higher road and the lower road of being man, because everybody's interested in the sins and aspirations of others. But then I realized, and that may be true, right? So there could be another S for that. But in the end, it became clear that what seduction really means at the basis in writing is creating anticipation. And then lo and behold, there's a whole specialty in neuroscience and psychology that studies anticipation and how important that is and how rewarding that is, in fact.
I really love that focus on anticipation specifically for copywriters, because a lot of us that write longer copy for more complex offers, one of the things that we're required to do is really play to the anticipation, because I often say the first sale you have to make is the readership sale, right? And so
Hmm.
how do you get someone engaged with a message that is a few thousand words long, as opposed to like a short ad for, a 30-second spot or something,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And the lessons learned around the keep it seductive really do play that up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. Because I think some of these tidbits are just fun. So the
yeah,
classic experiment in anticipation is done by George Lowenstein when he was at the University of Chicago, and he asked 30 students a lot of questions. And I'm referring to the data here. What they thought of consuming some good and bad outcomes. And one of the good outcomes was receiving a kiss from the celebrity of your choice. And then the
yeah.
question was, okay, so that's the outcome. You got it. Okay. How much more will you pay if you can wait a day to get that same outcome? How much more will you pay if you wait 3 days? And he went on to, how much more would you pay for a year? It turned out the students would all pay a little bit more to wait. And that's what's called anticipatory utility. Okay, this is an economics thing, right? There's
It's
actually pleasure generated, and we now see this in functional MRI images. I can tell you more about the different MRIs, but functional MRI images showing that the reward circuit in the brain is really cranking when you're anticipating something, and even anticipating something that's not so nice. And why is that? Because we learn, even if we don't get pleasure from, we learn. So we're driven, even sometimes for bad things, to enjoy the anticipation of them.
so many different directions. One that's a completely counterintuitive. I guess you can come at it from the other perspective and say we all want instant gratification, right? So how
Hmm.
much extra would you pay if this was supposed to happen in 3 days to move the date up to
Hmm.
today? But somehow the students recognize that they would actually appreciate that time spent in anticipation.
That's right. That's right.
That's
They say that, the scientists say the sum of the two, the anticipation, the pleasure of getting it and the pleasure of the anticipation sum to something greater. And we as human beings are wired to recognize, or wired to feel that way, that we are going to enjoy, we're going to get more out of this if we wait just a little bit. It's the old thing of like, I'm going to
yeah,
save this piece of chocolate cake and eat it tomorrow.
absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to that experience tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
So one of the things with anticipation, you talked about negative versus positive news stories, right? Like, and
Hmm.
and there is an anticipation, and I suppose this might be bleeding over into some of the other S's as well, because so many of them do. They
Yes, right.
Uh,
exactly.
but you talked about negative and positive news stories and how the anticipation circuits are firing, or I think it was negative and positive pictures, anticipating a negative and positive picture. Can you speak to that? How anticipation isn't necessarily based on expectation of a positive result?
Right, right, right. So the reward story, this is something that's pretty late breaking science, really kind of in the last 5 years that when the reward circuit's operating, there's a separation between desire and pleasure. So when the dopamine's released, it's making you desire something. And then later, if you like it, you gain pleasure. And then you also learn from it. So what they did in this one experiment is they showed people pictures of or no, they gave people captions of pictures that were going to show really awful stuff. And it
Yeah.
turned out that a lot of people desired to see those pictures. So the dopamine was going. But when they got the pictures, they didn't like the pictures. They didn't get any pleasure. So, this is interesting because this is a lot of the research in the reward circuit is done in relation to addiction, right? There's a
Yeah.
desire there for a substance, but there's not necessarily pleasure in gaining it. When you're addicted, you're driven by dopamine to desire something, but you're not actually going to gain pleasure from it. And some of the most recent research with animals is that you can even get an animal to repeatedly shock itself out of creating the desire for something that it doesn't end up getting. It gets a shock just because of the dopamine produces that desire. So yeah, it's all integrated. But anyway, that's the principle. So the reward circuit is driving a lot of things that in turn also I recall drive learning, because learning is the ultimate thing. Pleasure in the reward circuit is really just an incentive for the human to gain something that's better for themselves. And often that's just to learn something.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, now I didn't transfer this into my call notes. Let's see if I can grab it really quick. There was another quote where you said that there's an evolutionary drive in your brain to continuously update your grasp of reality. And I think that was associated with the smart part, right?
Mhm.
That we even if the information is not that relevant, there's something that pulls us, or not that beneficial, I think was the point. There's something that pulls us to that discovery of new information.
Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah. Discovery happens all the time. There's been there's some great experiments with the chapter you're referring to. There's some great experiments related to trivia.
Yeah.
Why do you want to know? Why are you driven to know the answer of trivial questions?
Yes.
And we're just driven to whether we gain from them at all. We gain nothing from trivia, usually a little yuck, maybe, but we gain nothing of great human value. But we're driven to follow that trivia, and there's a huge number of experiments that show that people are driven to follow it. Anything where they think they can learn, even if it's not learning something of value.
Absolutely. So I want to talk to a couple of the other S's, and I'm going to leave it a little bit open to you for any studies or interesting other research you wanted to cover. But I do want to share one thing that actually comes out of our field. So a colleague and client of mine runs a very large investment newsletter business, and
Hmm.
this is in reference to Keep It Simple. Runs a very large investment newsletter business, and at one point they did some research about renewal rates of these different investment newsletters. Now, you would presume the renewal rates are going to be based on investment performance, or maybe
Uh-huh.
how much you like the person who's writing the newsletter, things like that. They did an analysis of the Flesh Kincaid scores
Oh,
of
really?
all of the different writers, and renewal rates went up as simplicity went down, up to the point of about a 7.5. So roughly seventh to
Oh,
eighth
yeah.
grade reading level, or lower, had the highest renewal rates, independent of investment performance or anything like that. Um, and arguably, that's just because you feel like you can get it better, and there's a
Yeah. Right.
reward to getting it.
Right. Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
I don't know if you want to speak about any of the other research into simple or into the
Yeah,
other
yeah.
ones that you think.
This is funny because this turns people, the simplest things turn people on, right? So
Yeah.
there's lots of experiments to show that simple things appeal to people. And what's interesting is, again, this is driven in part by the reward circuit. You are getting a dopamine hit, and if it's simple enough where someone really gets to the gist in just a few words, maybe nobody's measured this, but maybe you're even getting a little hit of natural opioid. You are driven. It's a primal impulse to seek out, consume, and enjoy simple things. So one simple experiment, very simple experiment, is a researcher in Berlin, Angela Frederici. She did an experiment I like to cite where she asked people to read complex sentences and simple sentences. And the complexity in one case was simply putting the object before the subject. So it's kind of a passive voice thing. Instead of saying investors love profits, you're saying profits are loved by investors. Well, one has 4 words, one 3, but beside that, what they found is that when you have those kind of sentences, it takes the reader 1/10 of a second longer. That's only 100 milliseconds, right? Less than a snap of a finger.
Yeah.
But it's 1/10 of a second longer to understand that sentence. And uh, people only get comprehend it 90%. And I can't even remember how that's measured, but 90% as well with that more complex sentence. So add that up. How many sentences are in anything you're writing, right? And everyone takes 1/10 of a second longer, and people are only understanding it 90% as well. I mean, that's a huge disadvantage. See, I mean, yeah, you got to keep it simple. Let's see. There's another experiment I wanted to talk about. There was an experiment by a researcher that compared marketing pitches. One was for the branding, the 4 bulleted branding points of a company using adjectives. And let me refer here. It was broaden knowledge versus broad knowledge. Okay, sounds pretty subtle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Analyze and diagnose versus analytical and diagnostic. Okay, adjectives versus verbs. And
Yeah.
the people these experiments don't know why they're being asked these questions. These all seem like kind of crazy, dumb questions, right? But what happened is the groups of people that got the verbs instead of the adjectives believed that the companies that they were reviewing were more effective. And I say this because adjectives are usually add-ons. They make your sentences longer, right? So you
Yeah.
want to go with nouns and verbs. You don't want to go with adjectives and adverbs. I mean, obviously there's a place for them. There's a place for them, but
Yeah.
um,
It's really interesting. I think there's a lot of back and forth that I've heard over the years for the use of adjectives and adverbs in marketing. In fact, there's like a book called Words That Sell that not all of it, but there are large chunks, like pages full of essentially a thesaurus of different adjectives and adverbs that you can layer into your language to supposedly make it more compelling. But the science says that if you
no,
can focus on the action, if you can focus on the verb, as
right,
opposed to the um, uh, adding on the meaning through adjectives and adverbs, modifying the meaning that way, that it's more effective. I
right,
like it.
right, 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 right. There's another, just to give you another, because this is based on science. We know these kind of things, but these are based on science. There is a professor in Japan that actually took 2 write-ups of how to exercise for better health and tested people with them. One was the one put out by the authorities, and the other one was just use simpler language, said exactly the same thing. And it turned out that after people read that, how did they feel after that? This relates to the reward circuit, but I think it's fascinating. How did they feel? They actually felt, the people of the more simple version actually felt they were more likely, as in psychology, they call it higher self-efficacy. They felt they were more able to actually perform those exercises just because it had been stated more simply. In the science, this is called processing fluency. This is what scientists measure. How process fluent is it? And the more processing fluency you create, the more you're rewarded. You're rewarding your reader. This isn't just a matter of effort. This is a matter of driving dopamine and other neurotransmitters in the brain.
Yeah, for sure. Um, There was another bit of research, and I think it was from one of the later S's, one of the later sections, where it talked about, it was related to medical textbook language, and it was
Mhm.
talking about
Oh,
the
yeah,
heart, and describing it from a very removed perspective versus getting someone to using language around your heart, etc., and that
yeah.
impacted comprehension. Can
Yeah.
do you
No,
remember
that's
that?
a
Yeah.
that's a terrific one. One of the things I put in my chapter on keeping it social, which
Yeah.
doesn't exactly follow the research in that chapter, but I thought was important to connect it to the social issue is why is it effective to use the second person you instead of the
Yes.
first I or the third he and she? Why is that? I mean, people don't completely know. They have theories, which I'll get to. But this experiment was testing that. There were some scientists that that gave people two write-ups of how the respiratory system works: the inhalation phase, the oxygen exchange phase, and the exhalation phase. And in one version, they used the, and in 12 places they replaced the with your. Okay, that's all I
Yeah.
did. Everything else was the same. I'm going to read you a fragment here so that you can understand this. Otherwise, that sounds pretty abstract. During inhaling, the, or alternatively your, diaphragm moves down, creating more space for the, or alternatively your lungs. Air enters through the, or your, nose or mouth, moves down through the, or your throat, and bronchial tubes to tiny air sacs in the, or your lungs, and so on. Okay, it goes on like that.
Yeah.
So what happened? They had two sets of people here, identical language except for the and your. And what happened is the group that had the your group was substantially had understood substantially more than the group, and they also were able to apply that in testing afterwards as to how that would make a difference in healthcare. Substantially more. So identical information. Now, one of the things that scientists say is if you use the, or you might use he or she. Actually, I think that
Yeah.
this is not an experiment, but I believe this would be exactly the same effect. You are invoking what they call an observer perspective. Your readers are imagining observing this lung going in and out, someone else's lung, right, going in and out, and
Yeah.
oxygen exchange and all. Where if you put your in there, you're imagining your lungs going in and out. All of a sudden, you're in a participant perspective. So that's a little long-winded way to say that. Yeah, that's why copywriters should use you instead of the. I mean, they should use the
Yeah.
second person and not the third person, and probably not the first person either. Of course,
Yeah. And
other factors,
for
other
certain things,
factors always come into play. But yeah, go ahead.
yeah. For certain things, it seems like there's probably also some kinesthetic processing. Like with that language, it's just sheerly intellectual versus uh like I was breathing in and noticing my diaphragm going down and my lungs being given more room as you were reading it when you
Right.
said your. And there's that automatic internal reference that comes out of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so you say that, stop me if you like, but that brings up what I think is one of the most important S's in the book, and that is keep it specific. Now, that sounds like, well, yeah, basic writing, keep it specific, use specific instead of abstract and vague language. But what's important to learn from science is that when you keep things specific, what happens is the brain reenacts in the neurons for that specificity what you're saying. Where if you keep it abstract, they don't. So, example, I tell you, I washed the counter in the kitchen today. Okay, compare that to I scoured the tabletops. What
Yeah.
happens in your brain? Scour activates the muscles in the neurons that are in charge of moving the scouring muscles in your hand. And tabletop activates the visual circuits. Those actually reenact what you're saying. So understand that the primary and traditional language processing part of the brain is on the left side of the brain, starting behind the ear. That's it. That's the classic place the language process. But when you use specifics, you engage the motor system, like I just did. When I said that, this happened to you, just across like a hairband across the top of your head. and the visual in the back of your head. And if you invoke the other senses, whether it's touch or smell or hearing, you're making neurons elsewhere in the brain other than in the language circuits activate. You create sort of this larger brain buzz. And I think we all can feel that, right? Or at least you can imagine you can feel that. And that then becomes fodder for the reward circuit to really grab onto and say, I want more of this language.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really interesting that like we now with the benefit of modern technology can
Mhm.
actually look at brains as they process this different type of language and
Right,
see that even though we know that the language shows up in one particular area of the brain, an entire brain can light up with the right choice of content and use of language. And so your reader is engaged on just a completely different level.
right,
So
right,
my
right.
my audience is gonna kill me if I don't at least talk about the story driven part a little bit
Sure,
with.
sure. Yeah,
So,
yeah. I
what
love to talk
was
about that.
there? Yeah, was there a particular study or studies from the story driven
Yeah,
part
yeah, yeah.
that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I like to think it's the story. It's the final S in the book, right? And there's a good reason for that. Is because in part it's a collection of all the other S's, or it can be a collection of all the others. It's kind of the symphony, and the other chapters are the players. I mean, I don't mean to demean the other S's because they're all extremely important, but they often play into story. But there's certain things about stories that make them particularly special, and scientists don't completely understand this. But let me give you an examples, or give you a few examples of what the researchers shown. One is that
Yes.
when I start to tell you a story, or you start to tell, you told a story early on. When you start to tell a story, what happened in my brain? Well, we know, scientists can see that the firing in your brain, the pattern of that firing was duplicated in my brain. I became coupled with your brain. I was entrained by what you said, just by you starting on a story saying, oh, there was once a time when, so and so, immediately your brain starts to activate my brain in exactly the same way. Not only that, but what's so fascinating is if you tell me that story and I go tell my neighbor that story this afternoon, my neighbor's brain will activate in the same way. Now that's entrainment. Now we don't know entirely what that means, but you can tell that's pretty impactful, right? So there's another
Yeah.
issue I like to get at is that when you tell a story, the longer you go on, now there's a limit to this, right? Especially in copywriting. But the longer you go on, the more entrained you get. They can actually see that the brain fires more intensely. So that's of interest, I think, as well. Um, the other thing that's great about stories is that, and this is intuitive, but now we've proven this with science, is you actually remember them better. There's been some large studies, meta studies, as they call them in science, where they accumulated 30, 40 different studies and looked at all of them and what they all show. And they all show that you remember stories, you remember the information when it comes in stories better. So that's the power of stories. And when you intuitively think that they're really going to grab the reader, it's activating the brain in a very, very special way, and that of course is absolutely something you want to shoot for.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. A couple different angles that I want to hit with that real quick. Um, I mean, one of the great things about story is how it is recruiting all of the different
Hmm.
S's. So if I tell a story that involves my emotional experience around something, it's going to keep it stirring. If I tell a story, I'm
Yeah,
drawn to specifics, right?
yeah.
That in telling the story, most often there is going to be some element of specifics that pull the reader in. There
Hmm.
can be surprising elements. Often a good story is full of surprise.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and there's anticipation inherent in just the beginning of a
Hmm.
story.
Hmm.
Oh man, that reminds me
Absolutely.
of the time when,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah,
um,
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
I
So
s-
story is, like I say, it's sort of like the symphony. One little addendum there that I think is kind of interesting is there's also some research been done as to whether true stories reward people more than fictional stories. And so
yes,
there was one experiment done where they actually had people read the same story, and they told them right up front. One group of people, they told them the story was true, and the other people, they told them it was false. Okay, it was fiction, right? And
Yeah.
who enjoyed the story more? It turned out they enjoyed it equally. It didn't matter whether they knew it was true or false. They got engaged by the story structure. That's how crazy human beings are. That's how crazily wired we are to love stories. Now, there's the question out there is, well, would they act on it and would they learn from it in the same way? I don't know that. But in terms of whether they felt immersed, they reported whether they liked the story and they were hooked by it, identical. So, like in copyright, I do this in writing books, right? Sometimes you don't have an actual story, but you can
Yeah.
conjure something that is, absolutely reflects people's experience, and you dramatize it. And yeah, that story has exactly the same immersion impact on the reader or on the listener as the true one.
That's excellent. And the other thing that you mentioned in your book is media doesn't necessarily matter either. So there's
Right.
this assumption maybe that writing isn't as interesting because now we have TVs and all of that. But when people engage with the same story through written media versus other media, they're still having that same resonance, that same
Exactly.
reward seeking.
Exactly. And there's one study, and I think this is what you're referring to. There's one study that compared people getting the same story. Obviously, that wasn't verbatim; it couldn't be via writing. I think I have this right: via listening and watching it on video. Okay, video obviously has sound and color and action and people and all that. And then they asked people which ones they were most engaged by, and it turned out that the people did say that they thought the video was more engaging, but the imaging of their brain, I think I've got this right. It was either imaging of their brain, it might have been their vitals, their heart rate, et cetera, that also indicates how aroused they are, was
Yeah.
was just as great in the written story that they were reading as it was in the video. So underneath, the power of writing is still there. I mean, it's still there. Obviously, we get all these delectable things in video that we don't get in writing, but the power of story in terms of hooking people, grabbing their emotions, creating anticipation, firing them up with specifics, that's going to be there in your writing just as well as it is in video, which is reassuring,
Absolutely.
right? If you're doing writing for a living.
Yes, yes. So I want to pivot a little bit as we're approaching the end of our scheduled time here. How do you work? So we have 8 strategies backed by science
Yeah.
that can
Yeah.
help us write in more compelling ways, writing for impact in better
Right.
ways, right?
Right.
Um, how do you actually work that into your writing process? How do you use this where the rubber meets the road, the pen hits the paper, the fingers
Yeah. Yeah.
type
Yeah.
away on the
Yeah.
keyboard?
Yeah, very good question. I, you know, I think the first job in the first draft or the first sort of imaginings of what you're going to do is to be clear with what you want to say, right? What do you want to say? And that may be pretty uncreative, right? But
Yeah.
however you do it, you might do it with a metaphor, but usually you don't get there to the metaphor in the first go. It's usually something punier than that. It's some pretty plain words that you're scratching around with, and so it's at that point you start to say, once you start to feel like you have some accurate notion of what you're going to say, that's when. And so I don't think this happens as much in the editing as in the writing. Is how can I make that simpler? Because it was way too complicated on the first go, right? And how can I make it more specific? Because that word's just a little too abstract. I know I can do better with scour than I can do than with wipe or wash. And how can I create anticipation and so on? And should I use a word that's tinged with a little bit more emotion, and so on? And even to the point of saying, now that I know what the message is, can I adapt a story to show that? So that's often how I do it. And I could say, especially in books, which, are very long projects, it's in the second draft, the third draft, the fourth draft, and then very late in the process where you come to these realizations, oh my God, there's a terrific metaphor for that. That's often where
Yeah.
the S's come, because I think of these S's as the difference between writing that's clear So that's engaging. I use engaging in a more general sense than you would use it on social media. But how do you move it from one to the other? But I think you have to get to some clarity of what you want, what your goals are, and what you want to say first, and then you take
I,
off with these S's.
I think I heard this from you. I listened to the audiobook, by the way, so
Oh, thank
I'm
you.
an audiobook person. So
Yeah, thank you
uh,
for doing that.
um, I think I heard it from you that you actually talked about drafting as or writing in kind of two separate steps. Like one step
Oh yeah.
is you're not actually trying to. It's like if your draft for a document or for whatever it is one Word document, you have a completely different Word document that is just trying
Hmm.
to get the ideas out of your head as a way to
Right.
kind of mentally hack yourself.
Right.
So
Right.
step one is just get everything out, and then step two is to assemble those raw materials into what you actually want to share with the world.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I very much. I think one of the problems in writing, probably of any length, is the spaghetti problem. You get tangled up in the spaghetti that you got first down on the page, and a lot of that shouldn't have even been there. It's kind of like tripping over your own shoelaces because you don't realize that you tied them together early on, and then you were ready to really step out. So I divide. I tell people to divide their writing into writing to think and writing to deliver. When you
There
don't
we
know
go.
what you want to say, when you don't have the clarity yet, you better not be trying to fill that blank page. Just go. And I think this is it's similar to journaling, but I do think you do it with a goal. Journaling could be sort of free association over anything, but I think writing to think is you sort of you're trying to get at what you want to say, but you've made the decision that I'm not delivering anything in this document I'm writing. I'm just taking notes. I'm playing with words, etc. And some of this could be, you could use the same document later to go to the phase of writing to deliver. But really think about those two things separately, so you don't get so the residue, so the clutter, so the spaghetti, so the mess that was in there in the first place doesn't see its way into the final draft, because that's often what happens. You see all kinds of crud from the early drafts make it in the final one. And why do they get there? Only because you started with the same document. They
Yeah,
were the,
and
they were the cobwebs in the corner, and you didn't even notice. They're the woodwork. You didn't even notice them in your second draft.
yeah, and I think if you try to just write top to bottom versus this iterative process of thinking through, getting the ideas on the page and then cleaning them up. If you're just trying to write top to bottom, it's much harder to spot those
Exactly,
issues, the
exactly.
spaghetti.
And yeah, and you raise, I'll bring in my keeping it smart chapter as well. As neuroscience shows that insight, and that's the real great stuff, right? Insight is
Yeah.
combining what one neuroscientist I interviewed said was dim and distant connections in the brain. That's where the smart stuff comes from. That doesn't come immediately, and it doesn't come easily, and it may come in the shower, and it may come when you're consciously working on it. But he also found that often comes when you're relaxed. Well, when are you most relaxed? When you're writing to deliver or writing to think? You better be doing when you're writing to think. That's when that good stuff is going to come. It's not really going to come when you're writing to deliver. Oh, well, yeah, it does. Deadlines matter. Yeah, deadlines can help you deliver good stuff. But anyway, I recommend that
Yeah.
as a separation of duties.
I'm trying to remember the who it was. I think it's Pythagoras that figured out how to figure out the purity of gold. And
Uh,
as the story goes, as it's told in the movie Pi, which is a rather disturbing movie, um, he was trying to figure this out and trying to figure this out and trying to figure this out. And his wife said, "Go take a bath." And he went
yeah, right.
and he took a bath, which is a place where you would naturally be relaxed. It's hard to be working on your equations in the bath. And as he was sitting there in the bath, he realized that he was displacing a certain amount of water. And it said that he said, "Eureka."
Yeah, right.
And
Right.
and he
Right.
jumped out
Right.
of the tub and he realized that if he could figure out water displacement, he could figure out the purity of gold.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right. And I note, keeping on our subject of what the science says, is that when you have an insight, you activate a whole different part of your brain than you activate when you're just getting information. A whole different part of your brain. It's on the right side, about right here. It just suddenly glows with all this electricity. And the scientists don't exactly know why, but it's a very special thing. And that does not happen if you're just, basically going step one, step two, step three. All of a sudden you need to, you're leaping to someplace else. And when you leap to someplace else, either when you're writing, and this can happen to you as a reader, obviously too, when you're writing, leaping to that place is something you want to make happen. And the research again has shown that the reward circuit really cranks when you get an idea from insight, from the dim and distant, coming across the brain in a networked way that nobody understands right now. Our brain has 86 billion neurons and trillions of synapses. It's a remarkable thing. So let them work. Let them work. Let them do their magic.
Excellent. Well, so you have an extra freebie that we'll tell people about in just a minute, along with the book, which I highly, highly recommend. But before we get there, what's your biggest takeaway after all your psychology and neuroscience research into writing and writing for impact?
Yeah, my biggest takeaway, I just want to restate, it's my mantra: reward your reader. Think about rewarding your reader. But in addition to that, because we've talked about stories and we talked about the other S's, is that remember there's 7 other ways supported by science besides story to really please your reader, to really get them engaged. And so you don't always have to default to story as being the only solution to ratchet up that piece of work to the next level. Look at some of these other S's, because they are important too. Yeah, you can create the symphony with a story, but you can also create some great music with just 1, 2, or 3 other instruments. They're all very powerful, and they're all shown by science to make that dopamine flow and hopefully create some of those enjoyable other neurotransmitters. The release of those.
Excellent. So the book is Writing for Impact, 8 Secrets from Science. It will fire up your readers' brains. We'll include a link in the description with this episode to go grab that book. And also I will include a link to, on Bill's website, he has a workbook associated with this to put what you learn, those 8 strategies, into practice. And he's offering it for free to you. You join his email list and you email him a copy of your receipt from buying the book, because the workbook's going to work best with the lessons in the book. And you'll get a free copy of that workbook. So that link will be in the description as well. Bill, do you want to give any more insight into the workbook? I know we've covered the book in quite some detail.
Yeah. The workbook is valuable because it basically has pictures in color and it will inspire you, I think, to a greater degree than just black and white pages, which is mostly what books are these days. So yeah, get the workbook. I also put the workbook I wrote after the book, and so to reiterate what we've just been talking about, I think I actually did better in engaging readers in the workbook because I had that much more time to go from writing to think to writing to deliver.
Excellent. Well, I strongly recommend both of them. The links are in the description to grab those. Bill Birchard, thank you so much for agreeing to come
Absolutely.
and talk to a bunch of copywriters on how to write for impact.
Totally my pleasure. Thanks, Roy.
Thank you. And for all our listeners or viewers here, however you are engaging with this episode, thank you as well. And I will catch you again in the next episode. See you soon. Thank you once again for tuning in to this daily episode of Breakthrough Marketing Secrets. Remember, check out the links with this episode for even more value. Now make sure you like, comment, share, subscribe, and engage in every way you can to keep this show going and growing and delivering daily value to you. I'll catch you soon for your next big breakthrough.